What's going on, guys? Jordan Shallow here. We're at Iron Culture Gym in Cedar Knolls, New Jersey. We're going to go over a quick squatting progression for those of you who are looking to get into the barbell squat. One of the common mistakes I hear when going through squat progressions is squats are bad for your knees. So we're going to cue up a progression that's going to hopefully break you of this pattern and get you comfortable getting into a deep squat, not worrying about the safety or the health of your knees. So the first thing we're actually going to do is we're going to start with a walking lunge. Now, it seems a little different to start a squat progression with lunging, but as a general rule, if you can't stand on one leg, you have no business squatting with two. So what we're going to do with the walking lunge, we're going to take a long stride forward. We're going to allow that knee to travel over the toe, keeping that lead heel on the ground, making sure that back hip stays relatively internally rotated, so keep that knee pointed towards the ground without that knee touching down. Now from there, keeping the chest up, we're going to drive the heel through the ground, return to that mid stance of the gait cycle, and begin our next rep. We're going to try and complete 8 to 10 reps of these without the opposite foot hitting the ground in between reps. So we're really going to focus on lengthening the stride and staying in a stable position in between reps. Our next stop on the progression is going to be a counterbalance squat. We're going to hold a weight at arm's length. This is nice. It allows our rate limiter of the movement not to be the strength of our legs or our hips, but rather the strength of our shoulders. So it's really kind of hard to mess this one up. And intuitively, when we have this at arm's length, what we're going to do is we're going to cue our body to break in the knees first. A lot of people tend to sit back in the hips to initiate their squat. They sort of hinge at the pelvis. This at heavier weights could be potentially dangerous or at the very least inefficient. So what we're going to do, hold the weight at arm's length, we're going to break in the knees almost exclusively. So as we sink down into the squat, we're going to allow our knees to start to really travel forward and have minimal movement through the hips and pelvis. So we're going to complete 8 to 10 reps here, trying to keep a neutral spine, but trying to also keep the rib cage tucked down. We don't want our low back to be extended as we go through the reps. So keeping that rib cage tucked down, arm at shoulder length, and we're going to make sure that we're breaking in the knees as we sink into the bottom of the squat. From there, the progression becomes really simple. All we're going to do is start to adjust how we load the weight. So at arm's length with the counterbalance squat, it becomes very intuitive for us to break in the knees. Then when we move to our next progression, all we're going to be doing is moving the weight in. So the next one's going to be called a goblet squat. I prefer to use a kettlebell just to help keep the elbows underneath the load. This is going to allow us to keep an upright posture throughout the movement. Now, in the goblet squat, what we're going to do, we grab the kettlebell. Now the weight's going to be more kind of inside what's called our center of mass, so inside our base of support. So what I want you to do when holding the weight is still avoid that intuition of sitting back in the hips or unlocking the pelvis. We still want to make sure we're breaking in the knees as we descend into the squat, really trying to grab the floor with our feet. A lot of people, what they do is they end up kind of just tilting forward and they have no intent of rotation through the hips. So as you sink down into that squat, try and make sure that we're grabbing the floor with our feet as an expression of those rotation of the hips to stay stable in that bottom position. So here we're going to go 8 to 12 reps before we move on to our next progression. The next one is going to be where we load the barbell. This is going to be a front squat, and there's 2 ways to do a barbell front squat. The traditional Olympic rack position, which is going to lead with our elbows high and the shoulder flexed and externally rotated position. Now, if you don't have the requisite mobility through the elbows, wrists, and shoulders to get into that position, I'm going to recommend we do just what's called a genie rack or a bro rack for the bodybuilders out there. And that's just going to be bar across the shoulders, elbows high, kind of sitting in the crease of the deltoids. And from here, it's the same thing. All we've done is we've just progressed that center of mass from being very anterior to your center of mass, and we've just slowly started to move it in. So counterbalance, goblet, front. Now in this front squat position, we're going to drive the elbows up as we sink into the bottom, and as we hit the hole, we're going to make sure we drive our knees out, again trying to grab the floor with our feet. As we return and start the next rep, we want to make sure that pelvis stays tucked underneath, rib cage stays down, and the knees go forward. From there, we're going to move on to what's called a high bar squat. This is the most traditional kind of back squat we're going to see in most gyms. Bar across the top of the traps. Big emphasis on keeping the elbows under the bar. A lot of people shrug into the bar and flare their elbows back. As weight gets heavy, that's going to create a vector of force pushing you forward as you begin to fail. So keeping our elbows under the bar allows us to stay in safe position under heavy loads. Establishing good habits out of the gate is always preferred. So grab the bar off the rack, keep it high up on the traps, elbows underneath the bar, and it's going to be the same pattern where now we're going to break in the hips and knees at the same time. So drive the knees forward as we sit back in the hips, and we're just going to think the side of that barbell just moves in a straight line. So we're kind of configuring our body so that bar moves up and down. So just to recap the progression, we're going to start off with lunges. Seems a little atypical way to start a squat progression, but this ensures we have adequate range of motion in the hips, adequate stability to the hips to begin the actual squatting pattern. From the walking lunge, we're gonna move into what's called a counterbalance squat. Holding a very light load at shoulder height, arm's length, creates a long moment of extension. It cues us to get out of that habit of sitting back in the hips and allows us to break in the knees first. From the counterbalance, we're just gonna slowly start to shift that load in to the goblet position. Using a kettlebell, dumbbell, making sure the elbows stay underneath the load, keeping the chest up, tall spine. And then from there, we're gonna move on to the front squat, either the Olympic rack or the quote unquote bro rack or genie rack. And then we're gonna go up into the high bar position to finish that squatting progression. Big thanks to Iron Culture Gym here in Cedar Knolls. I'm Jordan Shallow. We'll see you next time.